They play an outsized role in defining our collective culture and personal identities. They're where most of the world's wealth is generated. They often decide the fates of elections, and increasingly, they define and control the flow of capital, people, and ideas between countries. Cities are the future of nations. In fact, 5 in 10 people already live in a city, and if this podcast continues to be heard until 2050, that number will grow to 9 people out of 10. In humanity's brief collective history, our cities may be our most important innovation to date, yet we've only scratched the surface of what they can become. Hello and welcome to Life in 2030, a podcast produced by QuantumRun.com that focuses on the trends and innovations that will shape your world over the next 2 decades. My name's David, and I'm your host. In this season, we're exploring the impact our generation will have on shaping the future of humanity. To that end, myself and a few experts will use this episode to explore the future of cities, how they'll grow, why we're drawn to them, and the new sets of powers they'll steal away from future governments. But first, some context. When talking about the future growth of cities, it's really all about the numbers. As of 2016, over half of the world's population lives in cities. By 2050, nearly 70% of the world will live in cities, and closer to 90% in North America and Europe. For a greater sense of scale, consider these numbers from the United Nations. Every year, 65 million people join the world's urban population. By 2050, 2.5 billion people from rural areas are expected to move into urban environments, with 90% of that growth stemming from Africa and Asia. India, China, and Nigeria are expected to make up at least 37% of this projected growth, with India adding over 400 million new urban dwellers, China 290 million, and Nigeria 210 million. Taken together, these points depict a giant collective shift in humanity's living preferences towards density and connection. More specifically, this shift is driving the growth of a new type of city, what urban planners call megacities. At least 100 million urbanites living together represent what is now defined as a modern megacity. In 1990, only 10 megacities existed worldwide, housing 150 million people collectively. In 2014, that number grew to 28 megacities housing 450 million, and by 2030, the UN projects at least 41 megacities worldwide. But what might be surprising to some listeners is that the majority of tomorrow's megacities won't be in North America. Sadly, due to North America's declining population rate, there won't be enough new people to fuel North American cities into megacity territory, except for the already sizable cities of New York, Los Angeles, and Mexico City. Meanwhile, there will be more than enough population growth to fuel Asian megacities well into the 2030s. Already in 2016, Tokyo stands first with 38 million urbanites, followed by Delhi with 25 million and Shanghai with 23 million. And then there's China, a country that knows how to do big. Over the next few years, China plans to merge their capital Beijing with the port city of Tianjin and Hebei province at large, all to create a sprawlingly dense supercity called Jing-Jin-Ji. The supercity will be roughly the size of New York State and house over 130 million people. This city-region hybrid will be the largest of its kind both in the world and in history. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Enough numbers. Instead, let's take a closer look at the reasons behind this history-defining urban shift. First off, there's no one answer explaining why so many people are choosing cities over rural townships. Instead, it's a collection of factors. To help us explore this concept further, we're joined by our first guest.
Hi, I'm Parag Khanna. I'm a senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and I'm author of the new book, CONNECTOGRAPHY, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization.
Parag shared with us some of his thoughts about what's driving the growth of urbanization.
Well, urbanization is very much a self-feeding process. People began to migrate very rapidly into cities in search of jobs, really chasing what I call the supply chain, trying to connect to international markets And as a result, wages have gone up, the quality of life is better, access to education and healthcare and other services is better in cities. And so cities become the place that generate remittances that are sent back to the countryside. But of course, because city life is sort of higher in terms of standard of living, it's encouraged more and more urbanization. And that in turn has actually fueled inequality. The inequality within countries is so high, not necessarily just because 1% captures economic gains from financial globalization. It's something actually more organic at the same time, which is simply the gap in incomes between people who live in cities and everyone else. So I think the quest to enjoy that higher standard of living, to enjoy healthcare, education, digital connectivity, ability to fly in and out of an airport, those kinds of things will continue to push people to move into cities for a long time to come. And that's why I take seriously the forecast that suggests that we will be 70% or 75% urban over the next 15 or 20 years. So, additional trends might very much be education, of course, building skills, working for international companies, having access to the latest technology, really so many reasons why people move to cities that I find it hard to imagine many things that would disrupt or reverse that trend.
So, when it comes to this self feeding process of urbanization that Parag mentioned, many analysts tend to agree that the factors driving this process tend to fall into one of two themes: access and connection. Let's start with access. On a subjective level, there's probably not a whole lot of difference between the quality of life or happiness one might feel in rural versus urban settings. In fact, some very much prefer the quiet rural lifestyle over the busy urban jungle. However, when comparing the two in terms of access to resources and services, such as access to higher quality schools, hospitals, or transportation infrastructure, rural areas are at a noticeable disadvantage. Another obvious factor pushing people into cities is access to a wealth and diversity of job opportunities that simply don't exist in rural areas. Because of this, the wealth divide between urban and rural dwellers is substantial and growing. Those born in rural environments simply have a greater chance of escaping poverty by migrating to cities. This escape into the cities is often referred to as rural flight, and leading this flight are the millennials who are overwhelmingly gravitating to more urbanized lifestyles. In fact, similar to rural flight, millennials are also leading the suburban flight into more compact and convenient urban living arrangements. But to be fair, the shift isn't just due to a simple attraction to big city living. For millennials in particular, studies show their wealth and income prospects are noticeably lower than previous generations. And it's these modest financial prospects that are driving their financial choices towards cities. For example, millennials prefer to rent, use public transit, and frequent service and entertainment providers that are at a walkable distance, as opposed to owning a mortgage and a car and driving long distances to the nearest supermarket. Purchases and activities that were common for their wealthier parents and grandparents. And perhaps the bigger factor powering urbanization is the theme of connection. Keep in mind that it's not just rural people moving into cities, it's also urbanites moving into ever bigger and better designed cities. People with specific dreams or skill sets are attracted to cities or regions where there's a greater connection of people who share their passions. Because the greater density of like minded people, the more opportunities to network and self actualize professional and personal goals at a much faster rate. For example, a tech or science innovator in the US will eventually feel a pull towards tech friendly cities or regions, such as San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. Likewise, a US artist will eventually gravitate to culturally influential cities such as New York or Los Angeles. All of these access and connection factors are fueling the condo boom that's building tomorrow's megacities. But what's the endgame here? What will our future cities become? So there was this stat we mentioned earlier about how, by 2050, roughly 70% of the world will live in cities, and 90% in the developed world. What we left out was that 70% of the infrastructure needed to house this massive influx of urbanites doesn't exist yet. That means for the city slickers listening to this podcast right now, The city you're living in could very easily double or triple in size and density in just a few short decades. This is obviously a massive undertaking, so it's important to ask how future urban planners will design our future cities to accommodate all this growth. To help us explore this question, we're joined by our second guest.
Sure. So my name is Alex Winter. I'm the CEO and founder of Placemeter. And Placemeter is a urban intelligence company that quantifies movement in cities at scales using computer vision and video feeds.
We asked Alex to share his perspective about what are the top 2 to 3 areas he thinks future urban planners will focus on when building tomorrow's growing cities.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you can clearly see in the way countries and cities address that issue. There's really two approaches, right? There's I would say the Anglo-Saxon bottom-up approach, where you let things do, and then you look at the problems, and then you fix them, and you iterate based on that. Or you have the top-down approach that would be, I would say, more French, maybe, or Latin, or Chinese, where the government decides to build cities this way or that way, sometimes from scratch, to accommodate and solve issues that are not necessarily there already, but might happen. So it's two very different approaches, and you can clearly see them in different parts of the world. Even in Asia, where it's probably the most striking, you have countries like, cities like Jakarta, for example, is really the bottom-up approach, where there's really huge issues in transportation, in housing, and then the process of fixing them. But it's going to take a little bit of time. And then you have the other way around in Korea or China, where cities are built from scratch without any people living in them. And once they're built, they're trying to have people move into these cities. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So it's very interesting. So I think the number one area where urban planners and urban designers need to focus on is to be a lot more data-driven. Urban planning has been more an art than a science so far, because it's been more of a static approach. You design a static city or a static neighborhood, thinking that it will work based on your past experience, but you have absolutely no data to prove that, and then you can't A/B test or iterate, right? So I think really measuring traffic flows, pedestrian flows, really precisely understanding what people do in the setup you've built or you're planning on building is extremely important. And we're seeing that really come to life currently. We're seeing a massive instrumentation of different cities with a view to really counting and measuring human flows. Then the other approach is that really needs to improve is a more agile and more flexible urban design. So instead of building definitive and final walls and streets and buildings right away, you absolutely need to go through a temporary period where you build temporary things, right? You temporarily change the direction of traffic flow. You temporarily widen or make a sidewalk more narrow with temporary barriers. There's a lot of things you can do temporarily to A/B test what you're doing. So implement one small change, measure the impact, and see if the change is efficient or not. If it's efficient, implement another change with temporary barriers or temporary builds, and see the impact, and also see the impact on the first changes you make. And then by doing all that in a very scientific and data-driven manner, you can end up in a place where you build a truly efficient new city that is really actually going to accommodate that influx of people. If you don't do that, you're navigating in the blind, in the dark, and you can't really get anywhere.
The 2030s, the 2040s, the 2050s. As cities age and absorb an ever greater share of the human population, they'll also begin commanding an ever greater share of the voter base. Put another way, within 2 decades, urban voters will staggeringly outnumber rural voters. Once this happens, priorities and resources will shift away from rural communities to urban ones at ever faster rates. But perhaps the more profound impact this urban voting bloc will facilitate is voting in more power and more autonomy to their cities. This trend of cities gradually stealing away power and influence from their national governments is what Parag Khanna refers to as a devolution of power. He explains it better.
I think that devolution is really the most potent political force in the world. It's even more widespread or prominent and really shifting political landscapes than democracy. And we see in every country in the world a devolutionary push. It happens either as a result of ethnic dispersion or provincial, nationalist, linguistic, cultural movements, or because of urbanization. Cities that are well governed know exactly what resources they need. They want to expand their own tax base. They don't want to share and recirculate their resources and their precious cash and tax revenues back to capital cities that are inefficient and corrupt. So devolution is basically something that is a consequence or accelerated by this urbanization. So I see in China, even though China is considered a vertically integrated command and control, basically an authoritarian system, at the same time, there is some degree of devolution with the formation of these 20 or 25 megacity clusters, where each is encouraged to have its own business plan, if you will, to have its own international commercial networks, to develop a stable sets of internal revenue so that the central government doesn't have to provide all of the financing. So there is, in fact, some degree of devolution going on, even in a place like China. Devolution, again, is happening everywhere. If you go next door to India, when modern India was created in 1947, it had only 14 states and provinces. Today it has 29. So, there is really a devolutionary push. And it's happening in the United States, of course, as well, where states that have their act together, want to make sure that they can retain or they'll raise state taxes and spend it internally, more effectively than federal governments do. So I really do see devolution as the entropy of global politics and economics. It's really an irreversible trend.
Building off of Parag's points, while our cities remain under the thumb of state and federal legislatures today, their continued growth into viable megacities depends entirely on gaining increased taxation and management powers delegated from these higher levels of government to the municipal level. For example, a city of 10 million or more people can't operate efficiently if it constantly needs approval from higher levels of government to proceed with the dozens to hundreds of infrastructure projects and initiatives it manages daily. Our major port cities in particular manage huge inflows of resources and wealth from global trading partners. Meanwhile, each nation's capital city is already ground zero, and in some cases international leaders, when it comes to implementing government initiatives related to poverty and crime reduction, pandemic control and migration, climate change and counterterrorism, and much more. In many ways, today's megacities already act as globally recognized microstates, similar to the Italian city-states of the Renaissance or Singapore today. What all this means is that in the future, the country you belong to will matter less than the city or region you live in. And it's this shift towards this global federation of megacities that will define humanity's progress over the coming century. So what do you think? In what way will this global shift toward urbanization shape our society, business, and politics over the coming decades? Send us your thoughts at feedback@quantumrun.com, or publish the most thoughtful feedback on our website. Or post a comment in one of our Future of Cities articles, also published on quantumrun.com. We go into way more detail about this topic there, and the links to all of these articles are listed in the podcast description below. Meanwhile, a special thanks goes out to Parag Khanna, best-selling author of the book CONNECTOGRAPHY, as well as Alex Winter, CEO and founder of Placemeter, for sharing their insights to this podcast. And as for the music you heard throughout this episode, it was composed by Karl Gutowski. Finally, want to support the show? Then be sure to subscribe, like, heart, share, review, and recommend this podcast to your friends. The more support we get from fans like you, the more often we can publish new episodes. It really does help. That's it for now, but be sure to join us for another episode of Life in 2030.